Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and how lovely to see such a wonderful turnout. And thank you all for your generosity. We have one of these fundraising evenings every year, and your generosity helps keep lights burning over the road, so thank you. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, just remind you about a couple of things happening at St Barb. We have now got an exhibition called Planting Ideas, which has some beautiful botanical drawings, how herbariums work, or herbaria. And do go and see it, it's beautiful. And the entry is opened today for the open exhibition, which is our next exhibition starting in March. So if you're going to enter, do get your entries to us. The paperwork, otherwise is all online. It can be found on our website. We have got lots of activities going on, as usual, but I thought one that you might not have noticed is that we now have a Saturday club for young people, which is funded by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Community Trust. It's part of a national initiative, but it is very popular, and we started it at the beginning of January, so that's something new going on over the road. Next month's speaker will be our very own Professor Tony King, who is going to talk about Roman villas, and he tells me it's quite interesting because are they or aren't they Roman villas? And he's going to talk about the new dig that he's been doing in Brockenhurst related to the Lymington River. So do come along. Next first Friday of the month is the 1st of March. So we'll hope to see you then. So tonight, though, we have Paul Atterbury with us, who is very well known for his role as the resident ceramicist on Antiques Roadshow, but he's had a pretty illustrious career apart from that. He studied history of art at Winchester, UEA, Norwich, and started his curating career at the V&A, which is pretty impressive. And Georgina's just told me that she was working there at the same time and you were very impressive, so that's nice to know. Anyway, he's had a long and illustrious career, but we're very delighted that he's coming to talk to us tonight. He's a local man, and he's going to talk to us about local ceramics from Poole Pottery and the early years. So, Paul, thank you very much for coming. Over to you.
The significant industrial ceramic concerns in the south of Britain. One thinks of Stoke-on-Trent and Derby and Worcester. Sorry?
Please use the microphone. Check the tone.
I didn't turn it off, but... Is that better? Okay. I won't start again. I'll go on from where we were. Anyway, I think most people will be aware that there has been a pottery in Poole for a long time. You may have been visitors. You may have gone to the shop. It's been very much a local phenomenon for quite a long time. And indeed, it was one of its many claims to fame is it was one of the first potteries to really realise that there were people called visitors who wanted to actually see around the pottery factory. And in the 1920s, when they opened a restaurant and a gift shop and all that sort of stuff, they were drawing in 90,000 visitors a year, most of whom bought something. So it was a very avant-garde pottery in many ways, not least in its marketing. But of course, we go back to the Roman period. The first pottery made in this area of southern Britain was by the Romans. And that pottery was simply for one very good reason, which is local clays. Purbeck in particular has beds of what are called Dorset ball clay. And it's a very good clay. It blends with other clays very well. The Romans discovered that. And that is really the basis of why there is pottery down here. Because, of course, normally, the things you need for pottery making, you need clay and you need coal. And luckily, by a fault of geology, they usually occur together. That's why there is the Staffordshire potteries and so on. Well, there's not much coal in Dorset, but there was in Somerset, and that was near enough. And so the clay was here, the coal was nearby, and so the idea of making pottery became well established. Nothing much happened after the Romans, though, until we get to the Victorian period. And factories were built in Poole and Hamworthy in the 1850s. And these were fulfilling a new and local requirement, which wasn't just bricks, but it was bricks and tiles and decorative terracotta. Victorian architecture flourished through ornamentation, and terracotta was the perfect thing to use for decorating buildings. And so those industries that set up in the 1850s were catering for that market to a greater or lesser success. They staggered on and not much happened. Nothing decorative was made. It was all architectural. And in 1873, one of the faltering and failing potteries was bought by a chap called Jesse Owen. And he was an ironmonger from Winchester. And he had simply, and a builder, and he had simply been a client of the pottery. And he needed the bricks, he needed the tiles. And when the supplies began to dry up, he thought, well, I tell you what, I'll just buy the pottery and then I can go on making the things I need. And it can't just be me who needs them. And this started a dynasty. He was called Jesse Carter. He's there on the top left. He had, amongst other children, he had two sons who came into the business, Charles and Owen. And the chap with the pipe is their son, Cyril. And this is the three generations that really made Poole the household name it became. Now, Jesse started out simply continuing making tiles and bricks and architectural ceramics. But that business really flourished at that point. And by the end of the century, as you can see, they were well established. They were making all sorts of things, as described in the catalogues. They had the advantage by then of colour printing, so the catalogues had coloured pages. So if you were building a hotel or a town hall or opening a shop, building a church, there was this access of ready available decorative ceramics that you could put into your building. And they began to export. And of course, the harbour at Poole was very important. Everybody knows it still is a flourishing harbour, because in those days, the coal didn't really come from Somerset. That was too complicated. It actually came from the northeast coast, from Newcastle and round there, and was brought down by ship. And so there were ships coming in and out, bringing in coal. There were ships going out, taking the clay, which of course was still being exported, and of course also the finished wares. And so this very decorative advertisement, which you can see, interestingly lists all the things they made. Tiles for floors, walls, hearths, checks, embossed, printed and painted tiles, mosaic works, fine art pots. And it was very, very diverse indeed. And as you can see, the buildings were right on the quay in the centre of Poole. And so working there, had certain advantages. Instead of looking out of the window and seeing yet more coal mines and yet more gloomy potteries, which was the common practice in Stoke. In Poole, you could look out and you could see the sea and you could see the harbour and you could see things going on. And these give an indication of the sort of things they were doing. Tiles of all kinds, but also more fundamental are actual structural elements. Buildings like that, those are terracotta building blocks. They're not a facade, they are the structure of the building. And so they go back a long way, they're big square blocks, and they're cast on the factory, and then they're taken to the site. It's a sort of Lego in ceramics. And in fact, it was very quick to build, because this is the structure with the ornamentation already on it, thanks to moulding and casting processes. So this became a major industry. Of course, carters were not alone in this. There were many rivals, particularly in the Staffordshire and on the Severn Valley, but they made a name for themselves. They opened an office in London and a showroom, and they were getting contracts all over the place, particularly for the pub trade and for hotels. Around this area, certainly in Poole, in Weymouth, in Dorchester, there are pubs with a wonderful, colourful glazed facade. Now, again, those are, sometimes they're tiles, as in the panel, but equally, they're often structural. And these are glazed ceramic building blocks. And this was very successful in this industry because, of course, one, it's colourful and decorative. Secondly, it's very easy to maintain. How do you clean it? Well, you hose it down. And therefore, it was very durable. And the rough and tumble of a pub could survive with ceramic walls. And equally, the various brewers, for example, Devonish's in Weymouth, had their own colourways, their own styles. And so you could see it immediately. Oh, it's a Devonish pub. Oh, it's something else. The other thing, of course, is that because it was a glazed surface, it was very reflective. So on a dark night, with the gas lights flickering, you could see at the end of the dark street, oh, it's a pub, let's go and have a drink. So it worked very well. And one of the legacies of this period, not just Carter, but of course many others, but these are Carter ones I'm showing you, they were often combined with decorative tile panels. And these often told stories from legends, history, what have you. And these were very much part of the process. So you could, in a way, decorate and, this is a nuisance, and illustrate. And so there were various themes like life in early Britain that a pub would pick out, or great queens of England, or whatever it might be, illustrated in panels. And they were also used extensively in hospitals, particularly in children's wards, because it was thought that the young invalids would be encouraged and cheered up by the sight of Arthur and his knights, or whatever it might be, galloping round the walls. And indeed, it was very, very successful. Carters sold tiles into lots of hospitals all over Britain. Very few survive for a very good reason, because, of course, although they're very easily cleaned, they're very insanitary. You don't have tiles in hospitals because the germs lurk in the cracks between the tiles, which you can't clean properly. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, that didn't really matter. And the other thing, of course, was shops. In those days, shops were identified by their decoration. If there were pictures of fishing boats and fish, it was a fish shop. If it was cows and sheep, it was a butcher's. It was very literal, but it made, again, these places very appealing and very decorative. So, you know, you walk down the high street and all these shops were competing to attract your attention. And of course, those with tiled facades and tile panels were always very popular. This was a panel that they made for themselves to identify their factory. The factories by now had begun to develop and spread. The original factory had been much enlarged. And they were experimenting with glazes. They were beginning to think about whether they should make decorative pottery. The market for tiles and architectural ceramics was absolutely huge and was growing steadily. So it wasn't a financial need, but there was a sense that particularly in the sort of the Britain of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, there was an ever-expanding market for decorative objects in the house. Now, you could have tiles in your fireplace, you could have tiles set into your furniture, but the idea of making objects that you could buy from a shop that were purely decorative, of course, was being proven to be very successful by companies like Doulton and Minton and Wedgwood. They were all doing this. And carters, therefore, began to think about whether there was a market for them in this business. And to put this in place, they found they had, working in their tile department, a chap called James Radley Young, who was a tile designer and painter. And they moved him across into what became the decorative arts department, and in a sense gave him freedom to do whatever he wanted. It was always going to be a very minor part of their production. It was never going to compete. But they thought there's clearly a market for this, but we need someone who will take charge of it, who knows about painting, he knows about glazes, he knows about production. And this chap seemed to fit the bill. I mean, now you'd call him an art director or something like that, but that was a term that didn't exist in Victorian Britain. And he began, with others within the factory, to develop coloured glazes, particularly lustre effects. This was a period when lustre was very, very popular indeed, and a number of companies were making lustres. And so the first pieces produced for decorative purposes by Poole was this range of lustres in various colours. And they were very successful. They were sold by shops like Liberty's. They made their mark. And the thing about the lustre glazes is that it's a slightly complicated firing process, which means that, as you can see there, the tonality varies continuously. So no two pieces will ever be the same. And this was the change that had been brought about, in effect, by the popularity of the arts and crafts movement. They no longer wanted to produce 800 things exactly the same. They wanted to produce 800 things that were broadly similar, but each one was different. So the sense was that the ladies who were buying these things, and it was always ladies, of course, they'd go into a shop and they'd look along a range of vases and they'd think, well, I like that shape. And they'd go along and think, oh, I like particularly that one. It's either darker or it's lighter, or the glaze has worked better, or they like the bare patches that have occurred. And they would buy that. And they would take it home thinking, and they put it on the mantelpiece or wherever. Their husband would come home and think, oh, God, what have you been buying now? Nothing changes. And they would think, quite rightly, what I've got is unique to me. Nobody else can have one exactly the same. It was a production line process, but the glazing made it quite distinct and different. There were greens, there were metallic lustres, and you can see how this slightly erratic finish, which in earlier days would have been called a failure and seconds, was actually what made them sell. And so the lustres were quite successful in the early 1900s. They also made a bit of lustre jewellery, lustre beads with different colours, which was quite successful. And so what they established, and it was Owen Carter who was very much in charge of this. His brother Charles was simply about, let's make more money from more tiles. Whereas Owen, who was a sort of more gentle sort of chap, thought, no, let's see if we can develop the domestic market for decorative objects. And they also began to produce pieces which had modelling. Particularly popular were these ones which appeared to have lizards and other animals crawling around them. The inspiration for this was probably Japanese bronzes. The ideas were there, it doesn't matter. And so they found within their own factory, they had people who had the ability. And this is a lady called Gertie Gillam, and she and her sister Lily were both workers already in the factory who'd been doing quite ordinary things. Because if you remember that photograph of the building, there was all that moulded decoration on top of the terracotta. That's what they did. They made the moulds for the casting of the terracotta. And so they were shifted across and were allowed to model things in a much more independent way within the decorative department. And so it was beginning to take off. At one point, James Radley Young left and then started his own pottery, but that didn't work, and so he came back, and so he was back there. In about 1916, the Poole Pottery was discovered by the Bloomsbury Group, Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant and so on. They all got on the train from London, came down to Poole and began to make pots. Because at that point there was a shop that was selling their products in London, and they thought maybe we should have a range of pottery. And these are pieces made by Bell and Grant. Frankly, they're dreadful pots. They were not great potters. And it's very annoying that when you see these, and there are, museums that have them, give them huge sort of star billing because they were made by key members of the Bloomsbury Group. But the fact that they were very indifferent potters doesn't seem to have struck anybody as being important. It seems our judgment sometimes is slanted. But anyway, they were quite experimental. Obviously they had an impact because they came and did their pots in Poole, they went back to London, they talked to their friends. And so in marketing terms, it was obviously quite a good idea. And it made the pottery better known. When Radley Young came back, he realised that lustre was okay, but it rather had its day. And he began to develop a range of pots that were based on either Roman or much earlier sort of primitive pots. He also looked at other cultures, particularly native North American, Indian ones. He looked at Aztec things. He looked at all sorts of early wares. Now, this was not uncommon. Our appreciation of what were then called primitive cultures was widening hugely at that point because of exhibitions, because of museums, because of books, because of magazines. The understanding of Aztec pottery, for example, hugely increased. And of course also ancient Egypt, as ever, was in the spotlight at that time. And of course we're in the late teens, early 20s, and so it's before Tutankhamun, but the interest in Egyptian armour was still there. And these wares that he designed have this, as you can see, it's a matte glaze. And if you think of native North American pottery, Mexican pottery, Aztec pottery, and of course early cultures in Britain, it always had that matte finish because they didn't have glazing technology at that point. The glazing technology comes later. So these were matte finished wares in a sort of stoneware with very simple brushed decoration. And these caught the flavour of the times. They seem to have a particular primitive quality. They seem to have an artistic integrity. And they were quite successful because people were then beginning to move away from the very sort of what we considered to be the very cluttered, filled Victorian interior. And they wanted a more open space and more elegance and more simplicity. And of course, if you've got a fairly bare interior, this type of rather basic pottery actually looks very good. If you can't actually get an early Cypriot piece or something from South America, you can put one of these there, and the impact is just the same. And so it's a sort of sophisticated taste for the primitive. And of course, when we come on to the development of the studio pottery movement in Britain with Bernard Leach, basically he's doing the same. He's producing something which comes inspirationally from an earlier culture and makes that statement about powerful simplicity. But these, of course, were not studio pots. These were commercially made. There we are. Now I've gone too far. The other thing that he... Oh, God, hang on. That's it. The other thing that Hadley Reid developed, well, he didn't develop, Radley Young, he realised that, of course, within the tile works, there were lots of glazes. Lustre had been developed for the tiles. And so there was access to coloured glazes all over the place. But what he wanted was a particular effect. Again, thinking primitive. Now, you probably know what I mean by Delftware, which is Dutch pottery. Essentially, it is a red earthenware body, which is the local clay, over which is laid a layer of tin glaze. Now, tin glaze is an opaque white glaze. So it's as though you've put a layer of plaster over the top of the pot before the firing takes place. Now, that tin glaze is very absorbent. And so the decorator will then paint whatever they're going to paint, usually in cobalt blue, onto that glaze. Now, painting on tin glaze is like painting on blotting paper, because the glaze is unfired, it's absorbent, and so every brushstroke has to be right. You can't make a mistake and correct it, because whatever mark you make is there. And so those painters and paintresses had to be very, very skillful at those immediate single brushstrokes. And it meant that certain patterns could be done. Now, if you think about it, you probably can visualize Dutch Delftware. Obviously, the patterns could be very, very complicated. They could be landscapes, they could be Chinese-style patterns. And what had to be developed in Poole was the technique and the process and the skill. Now, most of the painting in Poole, as indeed in anywhere else in the ceramic industry, was done by women. There were male painters, but essentially it was the women's province. And this was true of Staffordshire or Derbyshire or anywhere else. The complicated, delicate decorating processes were usually where women were good at it. They had great dexterity, they had great patience, and they were not a turbulent workforce who would misbehave and get drunk and all that sort of thing. And so they were very reliable. They also had those dexterous skills to do this style of painting. And more important, they didn't mind the sort of repetitive nature of the work. Because while every vase is different as it comes out of the kiln, the patterns are the same. And so what James Radley Young developed were a series of patterns with very simple brush strokes that, again, go back to earlier styles of pottery. But he's now looking at the Mediterranean, he's looking at Portugal, and he's looking at sort of medieval and later styles of country pottery from those places. And these ranges, very simple, again, were very popular because they didn't have the sort of limiting flatness of the unglazed wares. They had colour, they had glaze, they had sort of a vibrancy, but while retaining this great simplicity. And this, in a sense, really got Poole decorative wares going. As I say, they were sold in major stores. There was still this variety of piece one to another. They were never quite the same. And they became very fashionable. There were exhibitions and so on. And I think you can see how the thinking is to maintain that sense of modernity through simplicity, but to show something which is colourful and decorative. And, of course, other potteries were doing something similar, but this is very much a Poole style and a Poole look emerging. During the First World War, Belgian refugees came and lived in Poole, and some of them came from pottery factories in Belgium, and some of them were employed in Poole, and some of them were figure makers. So figures began to be produced again in a European style. And so the process and the market and everything was expanding through this period. There was still no sort of, the production was still quite limited because the casters were saying, okay, this is fine, it's selling, it's doing quite well, but we don't want to invest any money in it. We don't want to build bigger kilns. It can tick over quite happily. It's the tiles that make the money. And so this was seen as a sort of art department that as long as it kept its nose clean, nobody really minded. But of course it was going beyond that. And there was increasingly, particularly when the First World War ended, there was a sense that something needed to be done to increase decorative production. Now, tiles, of course, were part of that. The architectural ceramics were still going on, but increasingly were the ranges of decorative painted tiles made not for shops and buildings and commerces and town halls, but for domestic use. You know, these are tiles that were designed to be put in the nursery, put in the domestic bathroom, put in the kitchen. And so these, again, were part of that expansion of the range. And again, these were painted by the paintresses within the factory. Sorry, that's it. Now, in 1921, Cyril Carter comes on the scene. He is, as I say, the third generation. And he was a very clever man, and he came back from the First World War, where he'd risen to quite a high rank. He started out as a second lieutenant in the Dorset Regiment in 1914. And he then had a slightly mysterious military career, which took him to Egypt and all sorts of places. I think he was working in military intelligence. But anyway, when he came out of the army, he came back to Poole, and he looked at their pottery, and he wrote a report in 1919 saying, this is the way forward. We've got to change and develop the pottery in all sorts of ways and make it fit for the 20th century. And that included technology, it included new ovens, it included lots of things. And he gave that report to his father and to the family, and rather surprisingly they said, okay, Cyril, it's all yours, you get on with it. And so he did, and he planned a new factory, and more important, he decided that actually it was time to expand the decorative department. It had a big future. The tiles and everything, that was still carrying on, that was fine, but he thought that actually they'd only tinkered with decorative pottery, they needed to make it much bigger. And so in 1921, he took over a derelict building on the East Quay, which had been a pottery but hadn't been used for years, and he launched a new company called Carter, Stabler and Adams, CSA, which was launched in 1921. And he was obviously the carter. So what were the stablers? Well, this is Harold and Phoebe Stabler. He was a well-known silversmith and jeweller. She was a well-known sculptress or sculptor. We're talking 1921. So they both were people with very substantial reputations and careers. And they'd played around a bit. There's silver and jewellery by Harold Stabler, who was, highly regarded. And there's sculpture by Phoebe. She was remarkable. She'd worked in bronze, she was a stone carver, she'd worked in wood, she'd worked in cast concrete, making garden figures, one of the first to use that material in a sculptural way. And of course, she'd also played around, as many people did at that time, with ceramic. They lived in Hammersmith, and they'd built a small kiln in the garden where she'd modelled, glazed and fired her own range of figures. It was a very small output, but it got her going with the idea of pottery making. And so when they were approached by Cyril Carter to say, will you come and join our factory? They said, yes, we will. And so they were the carters, they were the stablers in that business. And indeed, she was a very successful sculptor, because what she realised was that once the pieces she'd made in Hammersmith in her own kiln, once they were remodelled for large-scale production in Poole, of course, there was a huge market waiting for them. And very cleverly, she sold the rights to the same figure, which you can see there, which is called the Madonna of the Square. She sold it, or she gave it to Poole, she sold it to Royal Doulton, she sold it to Royal Worcester. So at one point, all these factories were basically making the same figure. But of course, the Doulton and Worcester ones were in porcelain. The Poole ones were in a type of earthenware. So very clever marketing on her part. Obviously, the copyright issue, which seems pretty obvious, didn't arise for some reason. And I suppose it's because she held the copyright, so she could do what she wanted with it. Anyway, so this was going on. She also sold her models to the Ashted Pottery in Leatherhead. And these are a range of figures that were then produced at Poole. And so the figure modelling, which had started experimentally with the Belgians, now became a big-time part of production. And some of these, in fact, were produced first by her in bronze and then reduced down for mass production in clay. But again, they were seen to have a sort of primitive quality. They represented simple lives and simple people, and they fitted into that sort of market of that time. So, and that's one of the most famous and the bigger ones, Europa and the Bull or something like that. And it's quite big. And what it also underlines is that this is a period from late 19th century through to the 1920s. There was a big market for sculpture. Decorative sculpture was extremely popular, whether it was in bronze or ceramic or other materials. Sculpture was flying high. And so factories that made pieces in large quantities that were designed by famous sculptors would obviously sell well. So these were not pieces made by anonymous factory modelers. They were pieces made by leading artists. And that was the thinking behind Royal Dilton's hugely expanding range of figurines. All the early Dilton figurines were made by noted sculptors, because it was a way of getting hold of work by people you'd heard of. And of course the garden ornaments, garden decorations she'd made before in clay and in cast concrete were produced again in bright colours. Now these were glazes, of course, that had been developed for tile works and outdoor use, so they were completely weatherproof. Most coloured glazes will not stand frost and damp and cold, but these, are being architectural colours, would do so. And so that again took it out into a wider market. And I'm sure scattered around Dorset and other counties near here, lots of these still survive in people's gardens, unknown, unregarded. I've seen one or two, because of course the local market was very important, because as I say, right from the early 20s, the factory was open to visitors. And there was, as I say, a shop and there was a restaurant. And so a lot of products went no further than the boundaries of the county. And the tableware ranges were designed by Harold Stabler at that time. They'd never made tableware. Now, tableware is a particularly challenging process. It's obviously has to be mass-produced in large quantities. But they found very quickly that tableware is the bread and butter of the industry. If you've got tableware ranges that are selling, they will support the more artistic wares. And it's interesting, if you can see the handle of that tea set by Harold Stabler, there is a presentation cup in silver he designed earlier. And you can see he's basically taken the same handle form from his silver and adapted it for production in ceramic. And of course that's how designers work. And so tableware is launched by this new partnership. He also modelled figures and a new range of shapes, and new coloured glazes were developed. Things were beginning to go very, very well. So that's the contribution by the Stablers. Who were the Adams? Well, this is John Adams. He was born, he grew up in Stoke. In fact, you've probably heard of the Adams name as a tableware manufacturer in Stoke. He grew up in that background. He developed his own skills as ceramic chemist and designer. And when he went to the Royal College of Art, where he met his wife, Gertrude Sharp. And as soon as they left the college, they got a job in South Africa, setting up a teaching department in a college in South Africa. So as soon as they'd left, they went off to South Africa. And Cyril Carter, who had met John Adams before, thought, well, he'd be very valuable because of his skills as a ceramic technician. And so they brought them back from South Africa. They encouraged them to leave, and they came back. And so he and his wife, Truda, who is on the left, and I'll tell you in a minute why that's such a bad photograph, is they again brought in their own art school skills. She was a designer, he was a designer and ceramic technician. And so they brought in to that partnership something that didn't exist anywhere else. Cyril Carter was a businessman. The Stablers were art and design. The Adams were the technology of ceramic making. And so, in a sense, it's a perfect partnership. Now, that photograph was taken when Truda Carter was 53. It was taken at a wedding in 1943. And I have to say, this is the only photograph known of Truda Carter. She's the one on the left. Forget the one on the right. She was another wedding guest. But the point is, how is it that someone of, as we'll see, significant fame in the 20th century is completely unknown? And we'll come to that in a minute and why. But I'd like to show you a picture of what she was like in 1921, but I can't, because there aren't any. But she was a very clever woman indeed. And it was really her coming into the factory that really changed it in a way that absolutely launched it as a sort of global brand. And I think the key to this is in the pattern book. This is one of the many pattern books. This is the most important one, which is now in the Dorset Record Office in Dorchester, luckily, so it's safe. And what you'll see emerging in these patterns are the sort of styles that one begins to associate with Poole. Complicated, colourful, floral patterns. Now, don't forget that when she arrived in 1921, there were these rather basic patterns developed by James Radley Young. And it's quite interesting that at that point he disappears. And he goes back to working in the tile works, where he remains until he retires in the 1930s. So, in a way, history treats him unfairly, because he was the man who really got this thing going. But what it meant for Truda was when she arrived, there were certain patterns and styles already selling. More important, there was a trained workforce of women who knew how to do it. So she could step in and say, right, we'll begin off with some of those simple patterns, but I'm going to begin and develop a whole new range. Oops, that's it, thank you. And you can see in these early designs where they move from the very simple striped geometric patterns to something much more complex. So she works with what she's got, and then gradually the patterns become more elaborate. And as they become more elaborate, that also, of course, it reflects the increasing abilities of the paintresses. To do these patterns requires increasing skills. And so she had to train all these women to move away from simple lines and dots and zigzags into these complicated flower patterns, which you see beginning to emerge. And the thing about Truda is that she was not a potter. She never made a pot in her life. So her skill was in designing them as a flat pattern and then adapting them to be painted on the round. Because, of course, the flat pattern, you can't just wrap it round the pot and think, that's fine. You've got to think about how it joins, you've got to think about the curves of the pot. It's a very complicated process, moving from the flat pattern to design in the round. And she could do that, and she could train these girls to do it. Now, she was quite a hard manager in the sense that she knew what she wanted, because this is the pattern. They've all got no names. They've all got letter codes. So it's always 2 letters. So a pattern might be YO or LW or something like that. And that pattern was precise. So if you look at the top one of the flowers there, which is a very typical Truda pattern, that is the pattern, those are the colours. And if one of the girls painting says, oh, wouldn't it be nicer if this bit was in red? Absolutely not. You know, they have to follow the pattern book. They could discuss it with her and she might try it out. But these patterns were absolutely rigid in the sense of how they're applied. Now, don't forget, this is all this very careful hand painting onto this blotting paper. And as the patterns get more and more complicated, you can see the skills required in putting them onto the surface was extraordinary. Now, as these emerge, of course, what emerges and is very successful immediately is what you might call the Poole look. You know, we're getting into territory where you now feel familiar. You know, you've all seen versions of this. And by the time, you know, in the latter years of the factory, these patterns, or similar ones, were actually referred to as traditional. But of course, in the 1920s, these were not at all traditional. They were avant-garde in the extreme. And Truda drew her ideas from French contemporary design. She drew them from all over the place to create these multicoloured effects that she particularly wanted. And these ranges, and of course, when she's drawn that pattern, there it is. But that pattern might be on a vase, on a jug, on a bowl, and still be the same pattern. So again, the designer's skill is in adapting that pattern for different shapes and different surfaces. And again, training the girls, because painting a bowl is different to painting a vase. And so the skills there were terrific. And the shapes were usually being designed by her husband, John Adams, and some of them were traditional, some of them were designed specially for it. But when you look at the patterns, I say you can see France, you can see a bit of William Morris, you can see American design, all sorts of things. And of course, this was a great period for experimentation. You've got international exhibitions. You've got, for example, Paris in 1925. You've got the Wembley exhibition in 1924. You've got a sequence of great exhibitions in different countries of the world, including parts of Europe and New York. You've got catalogues, you've got books, you've got all these ideas from the past being drawn out. So it was a good time to be a designer because the sources and ideas were absolutely buzzing around. But France was, I think, her particular fascination, French contemporary design. And you can see there were ones that involved the famous leaping deer emerges at this time. And so through the 20s, Truda Adams became really everything that Poole represented. The tiles are all going on, we can forget about that for the time being, but the point is, suddenly, this was a sensation. Everybody wanted this pottery. Now, this is long before people like Clarice Cliff, long before people who are famous for inventing modernism in ceramics. Truda Adams got there first. I mean, she was doing this from 1922 onwards. And so it was a real pioneer in a sort of modern decorative style in Britain. And of course, they sold internationally very successfully because they had an international look. It wasn't just something that was maintaining a British tradition. And think of the brightness of these colours. These are the colours that went on the pots. Now, these are coloured glazes developed by her husband, John Adams. So the rather sort of limited palette that was existing, he expanded hugely through his own skill. So you can see why that was such a successful partnership. And the Poole name really became synonymous with modernity in decorative ceramics. They were still making tablewares, of course, and those again. And many of these designs were adapted and simplified by Truda so they could be applied to tableware. So if you wanted a breakfast set in this sort of pattern, you could get it. And her great skill was, of course, reading the market. Those very bright colours were very much a feature of the 1920s. As you move towards the 1930s, the colours become softer. They become more muted. And she could adapt. And one of the things that I think, in a sense, she established was that if you look at Poole's history in the 20th century, it basically reinvents itself every decade. The 1910s are not like the 20s. The 20s are not like the 30s. And the skill of her as a designer is being able to read the market and see how the market's changing and change her patterns accordingly. And she was still working. She retired in 1950. And so she was a presence right through the great days of the factory. And you may well say, well, why has nobody heard of her? And we'll come to that in a minute. I just want to give you a sense of these patterns. Now, these are mostly 20s patterns. I mean, this is supposed to be called early Poole. So we're looking to that point where the Carters are established, that partnership is there, and indeed, John Adams and Truda become the absolute keys to the success of the factory. The stablers are there, but they have much less input once John and Truda take over. And this is modernism. This is something completely new. There's nothing else like it really in the British market. I say, you don't get Clarice Cliff till 1929. And so there's a whole time when this is the only company doing something that was internationally modern in that way. The colourways can change. You can change a pattern by simply changing the colourway. And of course, that's been known in textiles and wallpaper forever. But again, it's interesting to see it in ceramics. And those semi-abstracted flower sprays, which again are totally French in inspiration, are something again that one thinks of. And and this is all, I say, down to the skill of those paintresses. Now, of course, many of those paintresses were daughters of paintresses working in the 1890s or 1910. If you were a ceramic paintress in Dorset, where are you going to get a job? Poole. So you're not going to leave, and therefore your children expect to get a job. And in some cases, there were 4 generations who'd worked at Poole. And many of those people, of course, are still around. Those who were working in the 70s and 80s are still here. But they are, you know, it was their grandmother or their great-grandmother who started that process. So the loss of Poole in this area is more than a loss of interest and production. It's a loss of job opportunities. You know, a whole pool of, sorry, that's a bad way of putting it, but you know what I mean. A whole ability of design, a whole skill has actually now been lost with the closure of the factory, because the next generation won't be able to go there. So Truda is a key figure in this story. So, and of course, though, that is again a very familiar Poole image of this time, the rather 20s running girl. So many of the symbols of that time are here. And don't know why that's there, sorry, I'll move on. And so when we look at, actually it was a summary, because those ones were ones by Radley Young. These are the Carters, the Trudas. And so it's to make that transition. Those ones were what she found when she arrived. These are where she took it. And so you can see this was really a design revolution in every sense. And that, and there is the Poole Pottery in the 1920s. And none of us will remember that, but that was where all this took place. And of course, no trace of that survives, unfortunately, today. You can walk along that quay, but it's a very different view. And the very famous, you can see in the distance, there's the gantry crossing the road, and that was for the coal to be unloaded from the ships into the ovens, which of course are blazing away there. And so that is a very familiar image of what Poole was in its heyday. And there was a railway track up for bringing goods in and out. But of course, it was also a visitor centre. They pioneered, as I say, this sense of the pottery is there for people to enjoy. It was very much part of that environment. And of course, all the families working there were local. So, and just a final reminder before we talk about Truda briefly, this is the War Memorial in South Africa, in Durban, designed and modelled in component form at Poole, shipped out and erected there, and it's still there today. And this, of course, was modelled by Phoebe Stabler. But again, it's just a reminder of the diversity that occurred there. Well, Truda, what happened? It was always a mystery to me for years why this hugely skilled designer had either been forgotten about. And the key is in the name. Until 1928, she was Truda Adams. From 1928, she's Truda Carter. And thereby lies the tale. In effect, she left John and went off with Cyril, the owner of the factory. And they duly married. There is obviously a conflict there, but the interesting thing is that all three continued to work together side by side for the next 2 decades. How that was sorted, heaven knows. And John subsequently remarried and so on. But it must have been a huge drama at the time. But that isn't the problem. They got over that. But what's happened later is that Truda eventually, she retires in 1950 and she dies in 1958. Meanwhile, in 1931 too, she built amazingly fantastic modern house called Yaffle Hill up in the heights above Poole, which had a fantastic view out over the harbour. And this was a typical 30s modernist house. The architect was Sir Edward Morph, and it was very clear, and Cyril was not his taste at all. His own house was a sort of arts and crafts house of about 1912, which he moved out of to move into this. And clearly, it was her inspiration. She chose the architect, she did all the interior design, and it was featured in Country Life in about 1932. And you can see this was one of these classic modernist 30s interiors, but totally designed by her. She's not credited, but you realise that she had to be the designer of it. So her major statement is this house in which they lived. And the visitor's book survives. And the early 30s is page after page after page of famous architects and designers coming down and visiting the Carters. So they were very much in that design firmament. It wasn't just about Poole, it was much more significant and international. And that all goes along swimmingly as far as one can tell. And then you come to the 30s and that all goes on. She designs steadily through that period. And then Cyril goes off to the Second World War, again, doing rather mysterious things which I haven't been able to trace, but again in military intelligence. And he goes back to Egypt, and there he meets a young lady working as a typist or something, and in the heat of the moment, a relationship starts, which is then maintained when the war is over. And at some point, this is a very brief summary, at some point, Truda obviously discovers this, but I think probably not until the late 40s or early 50s. And there were all sorts of stresses and strains. It is very difficult to get to the source of this story because the family have been locked up about it forever, and very little has ever come out. And as I say, Truda dies in 1958, the marriage having ended, and the same year Cyril marries his third wife, who is the lady he met in Egypt. And they continue to live in the house, life goes on, and he dies in 69. Now, what happened? Because there is that photograph I showed you, which is the only known image of her, surfaced in South Africa. And so it escaped because it was not available. What happened was that at some point a decision was made to wipe her from history. All photographs were destroyed, all documents were destroyed, all letters, everything that represented her in any way. And it wasn't just on a personal basis, because there must have been lots and lots of material in the factory, and that was also cleared out. And so, in a sense, at some point, and it certainly was nothing to do with the third wife, it was not revenge she was not involved at all. It is not unknown for the new wife to obliterate the former wife. This is not the case. And so at some point between her death in 58 and Cyril's death in 69, she was wiped out. How or why or by whom, I fear we'll never know. But what it meant was, apart from the fact that it's very hard to tell her story and talk about someone we don't really know what they look like, it's also meant that her reputation as a designer has really been lost. And why does everybody know about Clarice Cliff and not Truda Carter? And I'm not saying she's better or not. It's because in the public frame, she doesn't exist. And so that decision, whoever made it, was not just a personal one, it was also quite consciously to wipe her from history. And she is wiped. We only found, I didn't find, somebody found that photograph last year. So it's as recent as that we, and luckily, there was a member of the Carter family alive who could look at her and say, oh, yes, I knew her as a child. That's Aunt Truda. Otherwise, we'd never have known. And so she exists in some distant memory. And I think, hopefully, one day, some documentation or something will come to light which will give us a sense of not just what happened, but how great she was as a leading British designer of that period. So the Poole story is interesting, but it's far more important than just a local story. It was crucially important for this area. It brought all sorts of people in, it brought art in, it brought design. It put Poole on the map in a particular way, and thereby Dorset and the southwest. But hidden in that, hidden now, is a really important story about the emergence of modern design in ceramics in Britain. One day, maybe, we'll find the answer. Thank you.
Please. Thank you. For a fantastic talk. Does anybody have questions for Poole? Silly question.
Yes.
When did it become Poole Pottery?
When did it become Poole Pottery? Actually, that's a very good question. Originally, it was called the Architectural Ceramic Company and various things like that. It began to be called Poole, I suppose, sort of informally, but the actual name, I mean, the mark was Carter, Stabler and Adams Poole. The one at the beginning, which was on the back of a tile, said Carter and Co. Poole. So the word was always there, but the Carters dominated in the names. It becomes Poole, England, really, in the sort of late 30s, 40s. And then, of course, and these are all impressed marks, then you get the famous dolphin figure emerging in the sort of 1950s and the printed mark. And then it became the Poole Pottery. Oh.
Lady here.
I was just going to say, it's extraordinary that the pattern books that she created, Truda, have survived.
The pattern books have survived for a very simple reason, which is, of course, they were still in use. You know, they were kept in the factory because a lot of those patterns were still being made. You know, the pattern books are the only record of what was going to be, what had been done. And so they were treasured, quite rightly. I mean, Poole had a very complicated and messy ending, which some of you may remember. It was bought by various people, each one a bigger crook than the one before, and it all came down to the property and the land and all that sort of thing. And in the course of this upheaval and disaster, the pattern books vanished. And they were kept in the managing director's office under lock and key. And one day they weren't there. And we all thought, God, you know, everything of Truda has now gone. She's vanished anyway, and now her patterns have gone. And we didn't know what to do. I mean, I say we, I mean those who were interested. And sometime later, the pattern books appeared in a local sale room. And attempts were made, I'm deliberately not naming a sale room, because it wasn't their fault. Attempts were made to stop the sale, which failed. And what had happened was that the person who owned Poole at that time, or one of his henchmen, had sold the pattern books to his girlfriend, and she was then going to sell them so they'd get the money. And, you know, therefore, there was theft in the first place. But the auction house quite rightly said, well, the vendor has title, because carefully they'd given her a receipt saying, you know, that she had legally bought the pattern books. Anyway, what was done in the end was that a fighting fund was very, very quickly raised from various enthusiasts. All Poole collectors were told to ignore the sale, and somebody went to the sale and basically they bought all the pattern books at the sale, and so they then went into the Dorset Record Office. But that's an extra accident. But normally pattern books are the security of a company. I mean, Minton, for example, you know, always in the 1960s 70s, when I was working there, they still hadn't treasured the pattern books from 1800, because they are not just the legacy of the factory. You actually still own all those patterns. And if you said, oh, let's take this one from 1810 and reproduce it, you can, because it's yours. And if you haven't got the pattern book, you can't do it. So the books are always crucial. It's right at the back. Tons. I mean, Poole's output was prodigious. I mean, if you wanted to collect a lot of Truda pottery, you can start today. Look on eBay or go to any sale. There's plenty of it, because nothing was limited. Once a pattern was produced, assuming it could be sold and there was a market for it, it would go on being produced. Some had short lives, some had hugely long lives. Some patterns were changed later, because in the 50s and 60s, for example, they worked out that those very complicated patterns were very expensive to do. And so somebody began to count the brush strokes. And so they said, well, this pattern takes 58 brush strokes. If we can reduce it to 30, half the production cost is gone. And so they did. So a lot of them were simplified, not by her, but by other designers. But in principle, they're all out there. So buying the pots is not a problem. The problem is the lady who designed them. Well, I mean, the pots are the pots, As I say, lots of people collect them. But the point is, it would be nice just to know a bit more about, as I say, their creator.
Is there anybody still alive who remembers?
Yes. I mean, I've done sort of extensive researches, and a lot of my information comes from one member of the family. But there was a sort of closed, the family obviously knew far more than they would ever say, and never talked about it. But this chap was prepared to talk a bit. He inevitably knows far more than he's told me, but at least he acknowledges that there is a great injustice has been done. I mean, he's the one who said, oh yes, I recognise her, that's Auntie Truda, I knew her when I was 4. Because I say, she was alive till 58. So, it's entirely possible there are people who knew her. And it's entirely possible that outside the family, there are photographs of her in lots of local albums. But until we know what she looks like, you can't say. And I mean, the one test we did in the County Record Office in Dorchester, they've got a big Poole collection of documents, including a lot of photographs. And when we got that picture, some volunteers went through all the photographs in that collection, thinking, well, she might be in a group or something like that. Not at all.
Were there no signed pieces?
No, because she didn't make things. She was the designer. And I think this is the important thing to see, that she has a particular role, which is creating the designs, making them producible for the right cost, encouraging marketing and advertising, but she never made anything. The designs are what she made. And I think that's the way a designer would work today. I think she was quite avant-garde in the sense that she just designed for pottery. She wasn't a potter. Well, they got a printed signature. Yeah, but they didn't market Truda at all. Her name was never used in marketing terms. But then nor would anybody else's. Poole was a company that didn't do sort of names. Susie Cooper had her name on the bottom because she owned the pottery. That's fair enough. Clarice did because she was very, very good at marketing, and her name was part of the brand. Poole didn't think like that. It might have been better if they had, but I think they didn't want that sort of individual fame for their employees.
Do you know what she did during the war?
Truda?
Did she accompany her husband?
No, not at all. I mean, in theory, she was still she was still employed by the pottery. I mean, of course, during the war, the pottery, like everybody else, was doing other things. But of course, one of the things that of course, was tolerated in the war and afterwards, was making for export because it brought money in. So she was probably still working at the factory through that. No, her husband was in the army and went off and did whatever he did. I must say it's very, very hard to find his military service record. Not because it's hidden. I mean, certain people's records are still not released. And he might be, you know, who knows what he was doing, but I mean, it might well be that his is still not available at Kew, where all the others are.
This sort of paranoid occupation, it seems, just overflowed into the treatment of his wife.
We have no evidence, but it's...
I'm not saying he did it.
No, but it's... I mean, certainly...
I suspect that she might have had some involvement.
Yes, no, I mean, what I will say, the thoroughness with which she was cleansed would be useful if you had a military background. But I'm not saying that. We don't know anything.
Thank you. Truda's early designs were very punchy, and by the time I remember them, they'd gone very sort of wishy. Is that when they were simplified?
Yes. I mean,
It's
two
such a
things
shame.
happened. One, the colour palette changed.
Yes.
You know, the 1930s pieces are muted tones of blues and buffs and greys and so on, which is what the market required. But you're quite right. The simplification of the patterns done for financial reasons basically destroyed them. But nonetheless, they lived on as a shadow of what they had been. And one or two of them did carry on in their full strength for special order, that sort of thing. But you're right. They lost a lot in the transition.
One more question? No?
No more questions.
No more questions?
Yes.
It occurs to me that we are here in a great brick-making area. There are a lot of kilns here. I don't think there is any decorative ceramic being made.
No, there were one or two small sort of art potteries in the area, but there was no industrial production. Because, as you say, I mean, I think it's partly because Carter started out not just making bricks and tiles, but actually making decorative building blocks and making things for garden ornaments was something that was quite big in their range. So I think there was already a sort of creative element in it. And that set it apart from the conventional brickworks. Because if you're making bricks, you're making bricks. And the colour will be determined by the clays you're using. And you'll be using local clays because you do not move around brick clay. If there's a deposit, and the Romans have done this, if there's a deposit of the right clay, you use it. And so many grand houses were built where there was clay to make the bricks. You know, it's as simple as that. And so, whereas the clays for decorative purposes have to be blended, have to be changed, and therefore they are moved around. So, I don't think there was any particular decorative tradition associated with the brickworks in this area. And with brickworks in Kent or Sussex or anywhere, by and large, brickworks did not make anything other than bricks and floor tiles or roof tiles.
Well, I think at that, we'll let Paul get on the road back to sunny Weymouth. Thank you so much, Paul. That was a magnificent talk. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Safe home, and we'll see you on the 1st of March for a talk by Tony King. Thank you.
Thank you.